Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to a live stream about my Super Nintendo Classic setup. What we have right here is a USB on the go, new on the go adapter, 32 gig USB stick. My best setup yet. I've got all the different firmwares from around the world, both of the Nintendo Entertainment System and the Super Nintendo. So here it is. What we've got, we can access NES Classic firmware, Famicom Classic firmware, European SNES Classic, US Classic firmware, and Super Famicom Classic firmware. Also, we've got some Commodore 64 ROMs, Nintendo 64, Game Boy Advance, the full Super Nintendo collection, PC Engine, 32X, Sega Master System, Sega Mega Drive, Sinclair ZX Spectrum, my personal favourite from back in the day, Neo Geo, and finally the PlayStation. So what we'll do is we're basically starting out here with the firmware that came with the console. This is the European firmware that we're looking at, and we're going to now launch into the NES Classic firmware. Once we do this, the console resets and then reboots with the boot screen into the NES Western firmware. This can all be achieved with Hackchi CE. So again, what you're seeing right now, I always keep the firmwares in each one, so you can access these from each individual firmware, but then we go through and you can see all the games from the NES, all the original ones that Nintendo would have packaged with the console. They're all there, they're all accessible. You can check out the display, the options, all the usual stuff, it's all there. Quickly boot a game. There it is, it's Mario Brothers 3, or rather Super Mario Brothers 3. I'll hit down and select, back out we come, and I can store a save there. So I can play all my Nintendo Entertainment System games there that came with the console. But also I've got the full Nintendo collection here, the NES collection, here it is. It's arranged alphabetically in these folders. I've just split it automatically. And all these are set to use the standard Nintendo emulator that came with it. So just have a look at the Super Sprint here. Oh, didn't realise I were yellow. Okay, move it back. There we go. Working perfectly fine, I think you'll agree. And I can add more ROMs if there are any available, if I'm missing any, or if they don't work I can add them and mess about with them in Hackchi. So I've got the full collection of Nintendo Entertainment System here, looking pretty good. I'll just hit pause, down and select, and I'll save that for later. So I'm going to come out of this one. So in a nutshell, what I do is I use the Nintendo firmware to play all my Nintendo Entertainment System games. So there it is. But you may ask, obviously, if we're talking about this particular generation of Nintendo, we've also got the family computer, the Famicom, as it was called in Japan. So I click on that one, select it, the machine reboots, and it'll reboot this time into the Famicom firmware. Here's the Famicom firmware, and of course all the Famicom games that came with it. In this particular case, I don't think I've got anything in here apart from the Famicom games, because obviously if I want to play an NES game I can load the Western firmware and play them on there. But having this is interesting because there's a few titles on here that you might want to play. Kung Fu. I don't think that came with the Western firmware of the NES Classic. I remember playing this on the... there we go. Always a good game, this. Can I pull it back? Oh, yep, come on. Oh, maybe not. I think he's got me. Yep, he's got me. What a name, Wang. Actually, coming to think about it, I know a Wang. So there we go, that works really well. Looks like I've got more games. I'm not sure what's in here. Maybe it's the actual... Oh look, I've put them in there for some reason. But there they are. That's how we get back to the other firmware. So we won't go back to the Super Nintendo firmware yet. We'll go to the US firmware. So as usual, when you change firmware, the machine reboots. And what we're going to be looking at here, instead of the classic European or Japanese colours, we're going to be looking for those purples, those lilacs from the US firmware. And there we go. I'm just going to come out of that folder. It was obviously where I were last time, but you can see this is the US firmware, looking quite nice. It shares, well, it shares for the sake of how I've set it up. It shares all the same structure as the European, so I've got access to all the ROMs on there. I'll now jump into the Super Famicom Classic firmware. I'm hoping to make a how-to on this. I think it's relatively straightforward how to do. I should be able to cover it all in about 40 minutes, including where to get the files from. You know, obviously Google's your friend. You can search that. So just looking through some of these right now. Is there anything in here that's different? Okay, maybe I'll take a look at this particular one. I'm not sure what this is. Oh, what is this? Fire emblem. Awesome. There we go. Obviously not being too good at reading Japanese. I'm just going to take a guess at some of these. Hi guys. Mods and RetroArch. There's quite a lot of videos on YouTube about how to add it, but ultimately once you've got Hackchi CE up and running, and it's very important you use the latest version there of Hackchi CE, do a search for that, you'll find that it's just a case of going through the settings menu, or the menu at the top of Hackchi, and actually looking for the install mods, and then basically you just drag the mods that you can find online. One of the best places to get the mods from, I find, is somebody called KMFD Manic. Goes by the name of Kyland K on YouTube, and he produces a lot of the mods with the community, which can be used on Hackchi CE. What I will do is I will make a how-to video, don't worry, about how to do all this. But ultimately what I want you to be able to do is do this with ease, do it within about 40 minutes, and just follow a set of simple instructions to get where you need to be. I'm going to come out of this now and go into the European firmware, the SNES Classic. So again, it's changing firmware. Whenever you change firmware, it basically reboots the console. And if you decide to turn it off on a firmware, when you next turn the Super Nintendo Classic on, it will boot from that firmware, so it kind of remembers your last choice. So this is the standard firmware that came with this one. We'll just have a quick look at some of the things. I'm going to look at N64. That tends to be a bit slow. There's two different cores you can use. I think one of them's called Glupen and the other one's called Moopen. I found that Glupen is the better one for speed right now. So if there's two options, go for the one that begins with G, Glupen. You get a minor stutter with the graphics, but all in all, you'll see this is F0X. It's actually one of the games that runs quickest, so let's have a look at this. Let's go for Mute City. Just a bit of slowdown there, but we should get full speed during the game. I'm playing this with it's a Wii Pro controller, as you can see. That goes directly into the front of the SNES Classic. It's got analog sticks, so it means you can play quite easily. But obviously I'm looking forward to the Nintendo official N64 Classic, which hopefully will come out this year. It's just one of those excellent games, and it really does show you the kind of power of this little system. Runs it really, really well, I think you'll agree. This is one of these games that I could just play over and over and over and over. Of course, there are new cores coming out all the time, and you should find a good, reliable place for that. Once again, it's Kyland K, Kylandk on YouTube. Just note that down there. He's got a channel, subscribe to it, it's well worth it. He comes out with new cores and updates to his core set at least once a week, and it usually involves you know, better speed, better performance. Some of his latest updates actually have PlayStation Portable performance upgrades, and those upgrades really do allow you to play some of the kind of less CPU intensive games quite well. Certainly I'm a big Ridge Racer fan, and I'm hoping that eventually I'll be able to play the PSP version of Ridge Racer. Okay, I'm going to hit down and select now, and I'm going to store that save in there. Just for laughs, I'm going to try GoldenEye. For anyone that's tried this, you'll know GoldenEye is a really CPU intensive game. It normally doesn't have good results, but I think that there is a more recent core than what I'm using here that does run it very well. So let's see what we get. Okay, well that's a good start, isn't it? That's not too bad. Okay, looking good. And there we go. There's definitely a core update to this, guys, and it's something that I'll be looking to install soon. Right, I'm going to try and get past all this and get into the game, and then we can see just how bad it is. I will have to apologise because my battery does seem to be dying on my phone that I'm live streaming this on, so I'm going to have to cut it short in just a minute or two. But we'll just get through some of the more CPU intensive ROMs on here. Here we go. Guess that's not too bad. I've seen it much worse. Sounds a bit choppy. Oh, controls of this are a bit odd, aren't they? Maybe that's down, that's left, that's right. Is it the trigger? I can't remember. Headshot, there we go. Seems to work a little bit better than it used to. Hopefully I'll get a new core on there. Commodore 64, I just saw a quick comment on that. What I have in terms of Commodore 64, I know a new game was released called Sam's Journey just before Christmas, and it really was a brand new Commodore 64 game. So what I did is I basically tried to put that in there. And also on the USB stick, I've got a bunch of ROMs on there for the Commodore 64. So I don't think this particular game's working. I'm going to have to do some testing on this one, but it is a good game. If you haven't got Sam's Journey, if you've never tried it, I suggest you do look that up. But in terms of switching, I basically go to load content, navigate to the root, go into the media folder, and this is the USB. And then I can say, look at the ROMs, C64, and then I can pick any one of the C64 games I've got on here. I might pick 1942, I guess, or something like that. I'll browse the archive and just open that D64. Fingers crossed this should load without a problem. I say that, but you know, it's only been a few days since I loaded this core on there, and I'm still not too sure exactly what's going on. I know there are some settings in here that you can adjust, such as drive emulation, whether you're using PAL or NTSC, and I think that we do usually get some issues if we don't use NTSC, so let me have a look and see if I can use that instead. Okay, so I'll come back out, load content, and I will do the same thing again. Is there a recent here? Load recent. Yeah, that's that's why Sam's Journey didn't run. So again, I'm just going to show you now. Hopefully this will run on the C64. No. Still looks like there's problems there, but ultimately, yeah, you've got to faff around, I think. Hey? Spoke too soon. Okay. So as you can see, the Commodore 64 runs full speed, of course. I did notice some glitching with the layers in terms of, you know, when you get multiple layers on screen. Something not quite right about that, but then it tells me to insert disk 2. You have to go to the menu, disk control, and I can't remember, disk image append, something like that, and then you have to navigate to wherever it is. I'm not going to do that because it takes too long, but C64 games do work fine. Battery on my phone's getting incredibly low, so I'm just going to cut to the chase here. So what we've got, N64 work fine, Game Boy Advance work very well, Super Nintendo work okay too, that uses Canoe or the RetroArch SNES 9X core. PC Engine good again, 32X are fine, Master System and Mega Drive, ZX Spectrum also work well. Neo Geo good, and of course I think the toughest ask for this particular hardware is the PlayStation 1. I've got a few games on there. I always go to my favourite Ridge Racer, but I might as well just have a quick look at Street Fighter Alpha 3. Let's take a look at that. I know that's a favourite of a lot of people's out there. The thing to remember about loading other ROMs on here that aren't designed is you have to use RetroArch, and you have to get used to the settings. So once you've got a game working, eventually you can launch RetroArch by pressing minus and plus, or start and select if you're using the Super Nintendo controller. And then you can go through these options. You can change the video mode and things like that. So if I come back, I say settings, I go to video. At the moment we've got this like black border in between the curtains and the screen, but if I can just change that using the aspect ratio, and I can change it to 4:3. Obviously the black border is still there. You've got to know what to do there, and you can get rid of that on-screen display. You can change the overlay and turn it off, and then of course you get the full screen there. So I'll just come back out of that, at least if I did it properly. Off, that's right, come out of it, start and select. Okay, so as you can see, the Super Nintendo's running this really well. Using this controller, I've got analog sticks, so it's possible to pull off some great moves. I'm going to be boring, be Ryu. This was one of those games that I never really played. After the Super Nintendo, I really didn't touch Street Fighter until recently. But But I think you'll agree, you know, having all the different firmware, having all the different consoles, you get to the point where you've got everything you want. You don't need a Raspberry Pi and that Retro Pi setup. There we go. Yeah, don't lose it. Oh, or do you? So again, remember this is running on a Super Nintendo. Well, of sorts. But no, the power of this, it's definitely about 1 gigahertz in power. It's got enough memory on there to run it. It's very much like a Raspberry Pi 3 in terms of what it can be, what it can do. So hopefully over the weekend I'll find some time to do a video. I'll completely wipe everything off the Super Nintendo and I'll basically put everything back on. Stay tuned to my channel for that video. If you like what you see now, I quite often do a live stream, just a very, very raw output of what I'm up to, what I'm doing. Check out my other live streams from time to time. Like, subscribe, leave a comment. I always try and answer the comments. I appreciate there's a lot of people out there who might not have the technical savvy to know about how to start going about this. So I just hope to give you open the door for you, get you involved, and then hopefully you can take it on from there. All right, guys, hopefully you'll have a good weekend. It's a Friday when I'm recording this, so have a good weekend, and catch my how-to video in the next few days. Thanks very much. Bye-bye.